Hallelujah. The Holy Gospel according to Mark, the 16th chapter. When the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene and Mary the mother of James and Salome bought spices, so that they may go and anoint him. And very early on the first day of the week, when the sun had risen, they went to the tomb. They had been saying to one another, "Who will roll away the stone for us from the entrance to the tomb?" When they looked up, they saw that the stone, which was very large, had already been rolled back. As they entered the tomb, they saw a young man dressed in a white robe sitting on the right side, and they were alarmed. But he said to them, "Do not be alarmed. You are looking for Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He has been raised. He is not here. Look, there is the place they laid him. But go tell his disciples and Peter that he is going ahead of you to Galilee. There you will see him, just as he told you." So they went out and fled from the tomb, for terror and amazement had seized them. And they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. The Gospel of the Lord. The language that Mark uses to describe the reactions of the ladies who had came to the tomb is not the kind of Easter language we would imagine. We think of Easter in sort of upbeat language, happiness, joy, delight, celebration. We come together, we put out flowers, and we make the place look really festive. Because for us, Easter is all about joy. It's about this great thing that God has done for us. How God brought back from death Jesus, and because he did so, we live. But Mark uses these crazy words that are more likely to be found in a zombie apocalypse movie than in a resurrection story. Alarmed, amazed, terrified, and fearful. It doesn't sound like your Hallmark special Easter moment. It sounds more like a late-night sci-fi movie. The ladies' experience at the tomb is one that says this is not what ought to have happened. Now, after 2,000 years, we of course can say, yeah, it was a really great thing that happened there. But I want you to put yourselves in their shoes. I want you to stand where they stood. I want you to consider that 3 days earlier you had been at the cemetery. And you had watched as they put the casket in the ground, and they had put the dirt on top, and they had put sort of the temporary stone there, and the flowers were there, and the hearse drove away. And you had all gone out for lunch afterwards, back in the old days when you could go out for lunch after a funeral. And you had gathered and you had made peace with yourself, and then you decided 3 days later to go back to the cemetery to make sure everything was set. And you get to the cemetery, and the dirt's all been dug up, and the coffin is open, and there's a person sitting there saying, "He is not here," to which your response is, "Duh, where is he?" And he says, "Well, he's been raised." Yeah, right. He was dead 3 days ago. You too would be terrified, amazed, and you'd also run to the people in charge of the cemetery and said, "What did you do with Dad?" That's the women's reaction, right? Because it's only 3 days since they had seen Jesus crucified, and they had come along to watch where they buried him. They wanted to make sure they knew where Jesus was. And then he wasn't. And as much as we say, "Oh yeah, the angel told him he's going ahead, he's been raised," as God said, that's not processing right now. Because their dead buddy's missing. And they are amazed, alarmed, terrified, and fearful. And they don't say anything to anyone because people would think they're crazy. Right? Remember, back to the coffin, you go home and you say, "Dad's not there, he's been raised." And everyone says, "Can you see the doctor now?" It's a horrifying moment for them because it's the unexpected. It's the unplanned. It's the unintended. It's the never has happened before kind of thing. And yet over time, and it didn't take very long for them to start to recognize that it was in fact true. It wasn't just some idle tale that had been told. And despite the fact that it said the women said nothing to anyone, that didn't stop them, because pretty soon they did begin to say something to everyone, to the disciples, to the crowds, to the followers. And beyond the people saying anything, Jesus starts showing up in unexpected places, in unexpected ways, makes himself known. And they begin to understand the impact of this particular moment. And maybe their fear shifts from being afraid because Jesus isn't where he's supposed to be, to being afraid because Jesus is in fact exactly where he said he would be, alive and in their midst. And the fact that Jesus is loose, now loose in a bigger way than he was just walking around Galilee, is even more terrifying to them and ought to be to us. Because nothing will be the same now that Jesus has been raised from the dead. Peter begins to understand that the implication of this is that this message of Jesus, the message that Jesus proclaimed, is no longer limited to a particular group in a very small country about the size of New Jersey. But now the resurrected Christ draws people from outside to himself. And so when he gets to Cornelius' house and discovers that God is already at work there, he tells the story of Jesus and says, apparently, God is interested in you being part of this too. The risen Christ is loose and doing God's thing somewhere else. Paul has to help the Corinthians understand that this is not some idle story, but a story that's verifiable by the witnesses that are all around them. The risen Christ is indeed alive, and Paul, among others, has been able to see him, and so he can testify to the truth that Jesus is in fact alive and living among us. That's the good news, that the thing that we anticipated, the death that we know is ours, is not the final word. God raised Jesus from the dead to verify that Jesus' ministry and Jesus' proclamation is in fact the good news that God intends for all people. Jesus' resurrection from the dead means that our deaths are no longer the end. Our pain, our suffering, all of that is temporal and temporary. And there comes the day when God will raise us as well. In the meantime, the promise which Jesus gave them through the young man sitting there on the right side, he is going ahead of you. You will see him there, is the promise that is true for us. Jesus goes ahead of us, and we see him there. That might be scary, but we are no longer alarmed. We are delighted and rejoice that Christ indeed is risen from the dead.